another talk could describe how higher education is the key to the country's economic future. I have one like that. Certainly to equitable prospects for different groups and the disadvantaged. The current funding patterns are not supporting the system adequately. That's what I've tried to show here, both looking back and looking forward. There's also this terrible cyclical pattern. Those suffering most are those of low and moderate incomes and first-generation students who can't afford the growing tuition, are rightly skeptical of taking on the large debts that are required for them to finance themselves, and they often can't penetrate the complexities of our financial aid systems. The inequities get sharply larger in recession periods and for the several-year aftermath of recessions. In addition to other changes, new investments are clearly necessary if the higher education system is to keep up with the Joneses abroad. There's another talk about the competitors abroad that I give about all the OECD countries and so on with educating the younger populations more successfully than we are. The big question is how to shake more dollars loose from taxpayers, including corporate taxpayers, across the 50 states. Remember, this is a state function, higher education, largely. That's very important. It makes it a lot more complex in the current environment. The potential investment, I underline that word, investment arguments, are there if they can be articulated well in investment terms, communicated to the people who hold the money, and the returns effectively shown and demonstrated. So there's an accountability piece there. You do have to show results, and you have to convince folks that have the purse strings that you're operating efficiently, because that's the kind of pressure that's on everybody in publicly funded operations these days. Also, finally, it seems to me clear that somehow the federal government is going to have to play a larger role in this because there are big inequities across states, because this is a national problem of national scope. It's going to have to pay more, do more in higher education financing than it's done in the past. Hopefully this presidential campaign will surface some good ideas and lead to some new departures along that line.
This is actually in one of the displays in the FDR Memorial down in Washington, and I happened to walk through it a few summers ago, and it's pretty much summarizes a lot of what we ought to be doing. And he said this in his 1937 inaugural speech. And if you look at this and look at the test of our progress, I'd probably say we're failing it right now. We're in an environment where we do a lot more for those who have than those who don't have, and and student aid happens to be true. Although as Dr. Zumeta said, there's some hope on the horizon with some of the changes in legislation, and maybe after the elections of '08. So, but somewhere at the heart of financial aid, this is kind of what we do. We're enablers, at least we're financial enablers of access to students. The academic issues aside, if a student is admitted, it's our job to kind of help them find their way through. But the trend, if you look at over time, in prior slides, is we've been going downhill since the late 70s. And I always have to wonder if the New Deal kind of line of thought, and Truman had the square deal kind of thought, ends up being no deal for these students, or worse, a raw deal, because they're led down the path to say we can make it possible, and it's kind of not there. So, Dr. Zumeta actually made a very good point before. The federal government really has to take the lead. If they don't put money in, no one else is going to put money in, or no one else can put in much money. And what really happened in the 70s was the Pell Grant happened, a lot of money got poured into Pell Grants, a lot of money got poured into campus-based programs, and even those schools that were selfish sat there and started recruiting poor students because it was economically advantageous for them to enroll poor students because they brought money with them. And we almost have to get folks in DC to recognize that again if we're really going to make some inroads into enrolling poor students. Because right now, when you look at all this merit aid, well, it's merit aid, but it's also wrapped up in all these enrollment management techniques of leveraging. If you can throw $1,000 at a rich kid and they come, well, you've only thrown $1,000. You enroll a poor kid, you might have to spend $8,000 to meet their need. There's this economic equation that you have to look at. But So sometimes the answer is money, even though there are people who argue, it's not always the answer. Well, I think it is part of the answer. I think one of the mistakes we've made in recent times is we have trouble understanding the difference between effectiveness and efficiency. And I think given kind of the talk around town and in the halls of government, everyone wants efficiency. We talked about 6-year graduation rates. We talked about, time to degree, because we want to shorten it because it's cheaper. Well, maybe that's shorthand for saying it's more efficient. The problem is that whole drive makes people look for things that are cheaper, the unit costs go down. And we forget that with certain populations, you need to look at whether it's effective. And you could arguably say that, when you're dealing with students from a disadvantaged background, whether it's academic, economic, social, there's a lot of hand-holding. We run around universities looking for the holy grail of high-tech, no-touch. And for a lot of these students that we're going to be dealing with, it's high-touch. They need someone to latch onto, they need someone to walk them through. And it's funny, because in student aid, we're always searching for that holy grail of the simple student aid application. The problem is it's really not that simple, because you sit there and you say, simple for whom? And is simple fair?
When we're talking about issues of institutional racism or interpersonal racism, there's definitely some promising practices that are developed, that we have developed, and that I'm talking about them qualitatively and anecdotally for the simple fact that USD, as of 2 days ago, has the highest population ever, University of South Dakota, a little over 9,000 students, has 2% American Indian. So I know all of the Native students on campus. So, so there's a way in which I can say that I'm not going to provide you the stats, but I'm going to provide you the anecdotal evidence that's really overwhelming. Because I'll tell you right now, if you want to talk Indian country, you want to talk numbers and papers, you're not going to get anywhere. It's about relationships. It's about building trust. The myriad of politics that are created around identity, both Native identity and relationships with non-Natives in this area, that are very hard for people to understand who haven't experienced Indian country. And so much of it is tied to the simple fact that genocide was really effective, and so was colonization. So there's a real struggle to maintain a sense of self and who gets to speak for Indian country. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to tell you a little bit about who I am, is because the idea that people have been going in and out of Indian country and researching for years, a lot of people see that as equally colonizing a tool as anything else. So in other words, that I have to be accountable to what I'm saying, and you can call these people, this is basically an indigenous methodology, is what we've developed over the years. So when I say the grandmothers, that a lot of these people, I know their families, and that's what makes the difference. And that's how I ended up out there, because they said, you can do all the fancy dancing you want over in Berkeley, but if you want to make a difference, why don't you come out and walk the talk? And so that really got me all pumped up, and now I'm like, how can I get out? Only because it's so real. It's so real that, when I think of how I would give the anecdotes that are relevant for financial aid, one of the basic elements is that, and this is the important aspect to give you in terms of understanding how the Bureau of Indian Affairs works, is that each tribe has the opportunity to fund their members based on a varying amount of money they receive from the federal government. And it's so important to be able to say this to a crowd where it has meaning. That does not mean that by your mere Native identity you get a free ride. And that's part of one of the major stereotypes that still flounders around there. In fact, it makes it more difficult for many tribal people, because the money is so slim that you end up battling each other in very brutal ways around who's more Native, who's in charge of your tribe, things that become very nepotistic and difficult. And then the layer on that's so challenging at a place like USD, which is in the heart of Indian country, yet is an entirely white space, is that they will often expect that the student is going to receive a BIA money. They don't make any effort in the financial aid office, unfortunately, to determine what that amount is before school starts. Then if the BIA doesn't come through, that student drops out because they don't have enough money to make it. And this is constant and cyclical. And so it takes someone to pick up that phone. That relationship's very real.
The focus has to be on early success programs. Why? Because you heard this afternoon and you heard this morning, you can't just wait till you get to the 9th grade and say, you know what, I really do want to go to college. It's something that has to be encouraged and nurtured and supported from the very, very beginning. So what we are saying, certainly my experience in my own school district, Montgomery County, but others throughout the nation, is that unless we have early success programs, beginning with kindergarten, because this drive to compete in a global market is so strong that what we see is, I believe, an overemphasis on standardized assessments. But what that means is, what many school districts can do is assess kids even in kindergarten and begin to predict whether or not they are going to be successful. And you heard Freeman Hrabowski talk this during lunch about perceptions and judgments. How many of you saw the movie Crash? Okay, I mean, that tells us that, you know, we do make quick assumptions about people. So when a little kid arrives in class and one kid has been fortunate enough to have, you know, personal computer from the womb, I mean, before they were born, the computer was sitting there waiting for them, versus the kid who hasn't had any exposure at all. That kindergarten teacher, that pre-kindergarten teacher, makes some assumptions about whether Johnny can or cannot learn because they've got some other Bobs and Harrys and Sues in there who have happened to have the benefit of exposure to technology. And so that's very, very critical to, again, ensure what do we need in the very beginning. My own school district, we had to fight 6 years to get all-day kindergarten for every child because there were some parents first who said it was too much for their kids. Now, I have to tell you, in most cases, those were affluent parents who were exposing their kids. But we understood in our community, we had a population growing that if we didn't provide some structured academic work very early, those kids were not going to make it. And so we had to fight for that. But in the very beginning, we had some half-day programs and whole-day programs. And you know what we would do? We'd say, even though you're in an all-day program, your curriculum has to be identical to the half-day program. And every year they do an assessment to determine whether or not they needed to move toward a full-day program. And what do you think the data suggested? That full-day kids weren't doing any better than half-day kids. Why? Because we restricted what we would do for the full-day kindergarten. Now, fortunately, that has changed, but it's that kind of thinking. We need community-based partnerships. You heard over and over this morning, and that's something that has to happen. Why? Because schools cannot do it alone. Schools need the support of the communities in partnerships with the schools, whether it's parent involvement or substitute parent involvement or local faith-based communities. The reality is, if we want a kid to be successful, that they need those kinds of supports. It is important that a school board be willing to reallocate resources to those students most in need. My earlier comment, it is not about ensuring that the per pupil expenditure is the same. It is about ensuring that schools in this part of the community who've been neglected now have access to resources that they didn't have before, even if it means schools in the other parts of the community no longer get their increases. Now, politically, remember the politics of education. You're not going to necessarily say, hey, you know, you folks over there who are doing very well, we're cutting your budget by 50%. No, that's simply not going to happen. But what will happen as new monies begin to come in, as new budgets are realigned, it is the recognition that we can no longer continue to invest as much in affluent communities because those students are doing well, unless we have unlimited budgets. So it means what we have to do is begin to over-invest, which is really a bad term because we're not over-investing, we're simply investing to ensure that those students who need the support have that. So that's very, very important. Secondly, there's something called an honors AP potential identification tool. Kind of scary, huh? But what it says is we can now look at students and we can look at the kinds of courses that they've been enrolled in, and we can look at their grades and we look at their performance, and we can now predict whether or not they can really take on higher level kinds of academic programs. And what that means is certainly more data, and you heard us talk about more data this morning, but the reality is sometimes that data could end up being adverse, particularly on our students if they haven't had the challenge. New grading and reporting systems, very, very key. When you see a person has an A or B or C, what does that really mean in that local school district? And simply having, I'm telling you, a 3-point average or 3.5 average is nice, but if I've only been taking basic courses, that's not going to happen. So again, finally, improve performance management systems, and again, more aggressive schools are beginning to understand it's not just about having highly qualified and highly credentialed teachers, it's about teacher effectiveness, it's about whether a teacher in fact can relate to a student. What do we know about poor and minority students? That they react because the teacher cares. So I can be the best mathematician, but if I don't project that I care, we now have data that suggests that minority and poor student won't really put all they have into it because they have assessed the system, and because the teacher isn't responsive to them in a way that they understand, then they don't perform. So we need to be sure that performance management systems in our school districts are not simply about the basic academic data, but about what they're doing to ensure that students, in fact, want to get ahead.
We are at war in this country at this time, and it may sound like I'm being bombastic, but I work from the trenches of this, which is that they're starting with the University of Michigan cases, and just by a show of hands, are people familiar with the University of Michigan diversity cases? All right. So the Legal Defense Fund was deeply involved in litigation of those cases, represented students in the undergraduate case. And since that time, since the Supreme Court's decision, which we think of as a victory, which was that race was allowed to be considered in how universities and colleges look at people who are coming in, but more importantly, that you had the United States Supreme Court really recognizing the importance of diversity at all levels, so from higher education to our businesses to our military, and really talking about how important it is for our paths to leadership to be open to all. So it's a moment in sort of a particular place, meaning this U.S. Supreme Court, which I'm not going to say speaks for what the general sort of opinion is at the time in the country, but the United States Supreme Court really coming down and talking about how we need to open up pathways. So in that way, I think of it as being a victory. But what happened is that even though we won that battle, if we want to talk about that way, we're losing this war. And the war is about whether colleges and universities since then have really been able to maintain programs that allow women and minorities to really be able to access college and universities. And I specifically want to speak to four-year colleges and universities. And what has happened since the Grutter and Gratz decision is that there have been hundreds of letters that have been sent out by conservative organizations to colleges and universities saying, hey, you have this scholarship program for women, or you have a scholarship program that is largely for African Americans, the MIT engineering program called MITES. All of those programs start to get letters saying that what you are doing is unconstitutional under the Michigan decision. Not legally correct, but created a chilling effect. And so what we saw was across the country an abandonment of these types of programs or an opening up of those programs. And more so than even in the admissions context. So you think about the consideration of race or class or gender or other sort of indicators of disadvantage in the admissions context. More so than that, what the detrimental effect was on how financial aid and scholarship programs, because that's really where, when we talk about barriers to higher education, it's not just as much admissions as the fact that we're not actually providing people with the kind of resources they need to be able to attend college for 4 years. So when we talk about recruitment and retention of whether it be low-income, first-generation, or minority students, what we're talking about is really trying to make sure that we have those kinds of mechanisms in place, and that's where we saw sort of the real impact. At the same time that you're having all of these letters go out around the country, and universities, I unfortunately missed the morning, so I don't know how much. I work a lot with Susan Sturm, who to was your luncheon speaker. I don't know how much she talked about sort of what's going on in terms of universities and these particular types of programs. I think she probably talked more about sort of institutional change, which is an affirmative, positive way to look as opposed to the depressing story I'm telling you. But on top of all these sort of letters, what we saw was a series of ballot initiatives, and I want to talk about them because I think that you should all know about them, especially since part of what we're trying to do today is talk about what's going on around the country. So these ballot initiatives started with Proposition 209 in California, which the words of Proposition 209 are that you shouldn't be able to discriminate or grant a preference based on race and a number of different other categories. So it sounds good, right? Discrimination or preference based on race, something that we should support and vote for, which is absolutely what happened in California. But its implications and its intent by the people who put it on the ballot are quite different. And that is to sort of impose colorblindness, which is that in any kind of program, so affirmative action programs, in programs that are trying to voluntarily try to integrate schools in California, in programs that are financial aid and scholarship programs, that all of those would no longer be able to consider race at all. That is the intent. And its effect has been dramatic. And dramatic not only in terms of higher education, which means that UCLA and Berkeley being the flagship UC universities, that their enrollments of African American and Latino students dropped dramatically after Proposition 209. And there have been efforts, and I can talk about those, to try and sort of do more targeted outreach and recruitment to get those numbers to go back up. But why is that important? It's important because if you take a UCLA, for example, let's look at where it's situated in the lovely city of Los Angeles, California, where 73% of students who are attending Los Angeles Unified School District schools are Latino, and nearly 95% of students who are attending Los Angeles Unified Public Schools are of color. So if you think about what that means when at UCLA last year, when there's 90 African American students in a class of 5,000, it should give you some perspective on what we're really talking about. It's not only that these numbers are dropping; they're dropping in a time where California's high school graduating population is majority minority, majority students of color. So so that's sort of a California as one example. The same kind of ballot initiative was passed in Washington State. And then most recently in Michigan. And in November of this past year, I guess, now we're almost a year later. So in November of 2006, a ballot initiative was passed in Michigan that with very similar language. The only thing that was added to it was that it also included gender, which means that lots of programs that really are conscious towards trying to address gender inequalities were also taken off the table. What we've seen in Michigan is kind of what I was talking about earlier, which is that not only is the consideration of race and gender been taken out of the admissions processes in every university, every public university in Michigan at this point, that happened in January of this year. There has also been that same sort of exclusion of any consideration of race or gender in financial aid and scholarship, and that is really where there has been, again, a dramatic difference in who is going to actually attend the University of Michigan, Michigan State, Wayne State, all universities, and at a time when University of Michigan went all the way up to the Supreme Court to fight for the ability to have a diverse student body. And this shows sort of, the folks who brought Proposition 209 in California brought it in Michigan, and they're on a roadshow. If you told me that all of our students, African American and Latino students, for example, were being educated in the K through 12 context in a way that was preparing them for college, I would tell you, we shouldn't really worry about these kinds of ballot initiatives. But we know that's not the case, and we know in particular, and this is where class is going to come back in, that not only is it important where you go to elementary and high school, because the vast majority of African American and Latino students go to hyper-segregated schools in this country, which means 90 to 100% of color. It also means that they are racially isolated in a way that has lots of consequences that attach to it. So it's not just racial isolation, it's concentrated poverty. It's the fact that you're not only, it's not just funding, as Reginald mentioned, to go to these schools, but it's all the different ways in which that kind of disadvantage compounds itself.
I like to use this, the concept of hegemony, because I find it useful in explaining the manner in which children of American minorities are stripped of their cultural understanding, only to have it replaced by some kind of aggregate Western culture. Now, the manner in which this is done depends on the public school system, obviously, and its tradition of using textbooks that glorify this Western culture to the detriment of others. Now, this results in a kind of intellectual dominance of the American majority over other American groups, sometimes with the threat of force, both historically and contemporarily in schools. That is to say that, to remind you, if you don't already, if you haven't heard, that in American Indian schools, or schools that the federal government established for American Indians, they were punished for speaking their own language. They were stripped of their cultures the moment they entered their doors. They were discouraged from practicing any of the traditions of their cultures. So, quoting the Dictionary of Sociology, the cultural control that hegemony asserts affects commonplace patterns of thought and controls the way new ideas are rejected or become naturalized in the process that subtly alters notions of common sense in a given society. Going on, hegemony results in the empowerment of certain cultural beliefs, values, and practices to the submersion and partial exclusion of others. Hegemony influences the perspective of mainstream history as history is written by the victors for a sympathetic readership. Now, if that doesn't describe the condition of American Indians in American schools, I don't know what would. American Indians who graduate from high school and enter into college already are carrying backpacks full of contradictions. Has it deterred them from going to college because they continue to increase in size in American universities? But the point of all of this is that, as I said a while ago, if we're well grounded in American Indian culture and spirituality, then American Indians perform better in other aspects of their lives. And this is what I think will help provide access to higher education for our children, is that if they are allowed, or if the schools provide the opportunities for them to remain so grounded. And it implies that the universities have responsibilities too. One of the main responsibilities of universities is that they have to provide some kind of modeling behavior. They have to provide culturally based activities for American Indian. They have to provide opportunities for leadership in American Indian activities by American Indian students. And where this is done, our research has indicated that students do perform well. They stay in school and they perform well in school. But one of the most obvious shortcomings of American universities is their failure to recognize the importance of recruiting culturally faithful members of tribal communities to be members of their faculties. Another thing that you do is you create relationships with tribal groups. Like for example, if Baruch wanted to recruit American Indian students here, in addition to hiring faculty, it would be and establishing programs that would be relevant. I mean, New York City has one of the largest populations of American Indians in the United States. And there's an American Indian Center not too far from here that could be accessed for this purpose.
And we did a study that included about 70 programs, community-based programs around the country, that worked very hard on trying to get Latino kids through school and into college. And what we did, myself and a couple of colleagues, was we reviewed all kinds of information about these programs and tried to think very hard and talk to others and write an essay that talked about what are the characteristics of these programs that work. What is it that all these programs that are successful, what is it that they have in common? So what I want to do is run you through the list of factors. I'm not going to give you the big explanation right before the report and you'll have the whole thing. But I want to run you through the list of factors because I think it's a useful list to keep in mind. What were the characteristics of Latino programs or programs that work for Latino kids? Not all these programs were Latino programs. Some of them were, some of them were not. But they all work with Latino kids. Okay? What is it that they had that made them succeed? One, the whole question of, or maybe I should just not say for the Ford Foundation, adequate funding for the program. Right? If they don't have the gasoline, cars are gonna get there. So you need adequate funding. Okay? You go to a private school in New York, they'll charge you $30,000 in tuition. And you ask the principal, but how much does it take to educate a child? And they'll say, what about 40,000? You all know how much we spend on the public students, right? 12, 13? So funding matters. Rich parents don't put their kids in expensive schools because they don't think money matters. They put their kids in expensive schools because they know what money can buy, and they want to buy it. Thank you. Number two, the programs that succeeded were programs that incorporated Latino culture into services and programs in any way, in some way, and consciously and explicitly. So you cannot say you want to succeed with Latino kids, if similar with, I'm sure, Native American kids, unless you incorporate the culture organically into the program. And you think really hard about how you're going to do that. It's not about how these kids can fit into my program, it's how can I adapt my program to the culture and the needs of the kids and make it more attractive. Clearly funding, clearly the role of culture. The programs that succeeded have some capacity to incorporate and provide services in Spanish language. Not to all the kids, not all the kids need it, but that capacity to understand the world in both languages translated into more capacity to really do good work. They had dedicated professional staff with a significant Latino presence. Programs that did not, similar to the argument about faculty, programs that were similar to others but that had less Latino faculty were less likely to succeed than those that had Latino faculty. Think of it as a mentorship role, a role modeling role, a kind of social responsibility model. But having professionals of the culture matters, not just because they're going to infuse the place with the culture, but because they're going to go the extra mile and understand some of the nuances. Programs that included youth in the process or made some kind of an attempt to include youth in the process were better than those that did not. Programs that provided kind of client-centered programs that involved the parents and were sensitive to family circumstances operated better than those that did not. Think of those programs that see the family as a deficit and programs that see the family as a source of support. So programs that saw the family, even with all their problems, as potential sources of support were more likely to succeed than those that simply saw the family as a collection of problems. Programs that focus explicitly on providing tools and opportunities for youth development were successful. And again, the explanations as to what each one of these things mean is really in the article. I won't take a lot of time going over them. Programs that offer comprehensive services and case management, that they just didn't focus on the homework piece. But if you had a homework piece, but it was somehow tied with other types of programs, you were more likely to be more effective in the homework piece than if you did not have other support services, because people come with multiple needs, and that's essential that as many of those are taken care of. Incorporate the family as an asset and resource, as I've mentioned. Actively involve parents in the academic experience of their children, and we'll try to work on that connection. And that doesn't mean necessarily that I saw an article about some school, I think it may have been this morning or yesterday, that some teacher that's sending homework to the parents to do and all that. And that can be really cute. But there are potential dangers and challenges of that. And we already know in Latino communities, a challenge that the low education levels of parents are really alienating enough that if we're not going to start judging kids on the basis of how much their parents are going to be doing their homework, I think it can be even more of a source of inequality as opposed to a source of bringing people together and a source of including the parents. Because parents already feel ill-equipped to help their children do their homework. Parents are already embarrassed to be asked by high school students to help them in their math homework because they just don't know. They're parents that don't know how to read and write. So it's really important that, that parents are involved in the experience of the kids, but that parents are involved where they are in the experience of their kids, not where we expect them to be. We're not assuming that they're all college educated, and if they cannot help their kids as a college educated parent, could help their kids, and somehow it's their problem or their deficit. So active parental involvement, but in a way that understands where these parents are and what they can provide. And there are programs that have had very positive effects, literacy programs, where the person, him or herself, may not have benefited a lot, but their capacity to be able to help their children do homework is kind of a very indirect positive type of a benefit. Programs that have really clearly defined service outcomes did a lot better than those where the outcomes were a little bit more ambiguously defined or openly defined. Simply saying, I want to make sure kids make it to college is different than saying we want to place X number of kids in X type of college. Goals and how those goals are defined made a difference. Knowledge of the best available professional practices in the field. Programs that were not afraid to read the research, to innovate, to create, and did not stick to old ways of doing things because those are the only ways we know how to do things, were more successful. Because kids today learn very differently than kids in the past did not learn. You know, because multimedia technologies and all of that are changing even the way kids are, their attention span, the way they receive information, the way they consume information, the way they produce information, the way they share information. And programs that understand that and tap into that are a lot more likely to succeed than those that simply ignore it and say, I wish, you know, Johnny read, you know, Kafka, you know, his glory under a candle, you know. Community participation, involvement, and support was essential. Programs that were able to rally the community around them were able to succeed more. Professional and capable leadership in the program is essential. Programs that have developed some kind of political expertise or capacity to sell what they did to the political class were more successful. So it's not just about doing a good job, it's being able to sell that good job so that you can secure sources of funding for the program. And programs that used evaluation techniques and that were able to document and publicize their results did a lot better than programs that did not. So if you are in a community running some kind of education intervention, it will likely be a good idea to try to document the successes of that effort because that aids, that helps in replication. So as you can see, what I've tried to do is kind of supplement a little bit what my colleagues have talked about and to show you how this process of getting into college is simply not just about attitudes.
We think that urban debate leagues are wonderful models for access and transition programs. So we wanted to talk about what is policy debate for those of you who haven't been introduced to policy debate before. Policy debate is highly structured. It involves two-person teams competing against each other, and those teams come from high school squads. By the way, you'll see what we say, and then you'll see what our kids say. All right, so you've got our explanation and then our kids' explanation of what it is. Our kids compete at local, regional, and national levels, and they go to debate camps across the country. So we spend much of our time on school buses, and our kids fly all over, and they get very excited about that, and that's part of the strength of the program as well. Policy debate centers around evidence-based argumentation, and some great studies have shown that it improves critical thinking, reading, comprehension skills, and actually reduces risk-taking behavior because if you're at debate practice, you can't get into trouble.
Sort of intrinsic to the urban debate league model is the college mentoring component. Urban debate leagues in cities around the United States are premised on this idea of local college involvement that will occur. And so students from the coalition that I work with, from Columbia and NYU and Fordham and New School and CUNY, work with local New York City high school students, both as models of students who've been in New York City or now going to college in New York City, but also talking about what their college experiences are like, and then we send them to other college campuses where there are other college students working, and it sort of broadens that process. And that has come about due to the specific economic and travel constraints that at once had collapsed debate in this country in the 70s due to budget cuts. But now we create these cooperative models to grow a critical thinking, public speaking, and research-based academic activity.
Cool. So now that you've got all of that, here's what we'd like you to take away from our presentation. We think debate works because it's intellectually rigorous, and you've heard this from the keynote speaker today. Our kids compete with each other over ideas. One of my favorite stories is that I had a 15-year-old, I asked her what her goals were at the beginning of the year, and she said, I want to become the national Heidegger expert. I said, okay. I got her all the books written by Heidegger, sat her in a corner for 6 months. She's part of our Baruch debate team. Debate is centered around critical thinking, literacy, all the things we think students need to be good at when they go to college, all the things we're worried about. It's a team sport that requires students to step up and lead. They have to lead their squads. They have to compete against other teams. And the next step, urban debate leagues are built around community. They're communities that foster ties between students and teachers, between different high schools, and colleges. So you get this whole program about ties and communities. And finally, we like urban debate leagues because we think they're good bridges from home to college. If you're a debater in New York City, then you're the same debater at the University of Vermont. Like Vic said, you speak a strange language. I'll tell you more if you want to know about some of the jargon we use. There's hundreds of words, but you become a very specialized sort of person. So we just want to leave you with this as a model of both a critical thinking activity and a way to build community ties that engage high schools and colleges and help students while they're in high school and once they go off to college communities.
Ranchy Settlement basically does, cradle to grave. We have daycare, early Head Start, after school, senior program. We service the entire family. But initially in my assessment in the work of the collaboration, we realized that I think it was like 4, maybe 5 high schools in the immediate area, and all of them students of color, ranging from like 300 students to 3,000 students. Not one had a college program. Not one. Now, actually, I came from a high school that had one, but didn't really help the students, of color, to now going into a community that's all students of color and not having not one college program. I was just like, there's no way in the world that we're gonna be doing after school and preparing these kids and getting them ready, and they don't have any resources to help them. And you're talking about also a community that's predominantly new immigrants. We created the College Career Discovery Center. We started very small. I think it was $7,000 like 7 years ago. We hired a part-time college counselor to work at the community center. He was from the Lower East Side, had graduated from Binghamton, got his MBA from Connecticut, and went to the high school, one of the high schools in the area. What better role model? From that to having, $200,000 budget with a college counselor in every school. Some of the things that we do in this process is workshops on academics. We do the Regent Prep, SAT preps. We have financial aid workshops, which I think is really critical. We do the College Life 101, what to expect when you get to college. On the finances, we do that credit card issue, big issue now for students of color. They go and get credit cards. And one of the major issues that we found when kids return back and sort of didn't succeed early on is that they couldn't get support on the university level on terms of the financial aid packages. And they start using these credit cards to pay their books, to do everything management to stay in the school. And next thing you know, they're getting these credit card issues, can't pay the finance charges, the fees that come with it, and then they drop out because they feel they gotta pay, work. Helping the students, literally, when we find out that they get a letter of acceptance and they decide on that school, we help them map out the resources of the school. We literally get the map. Most schools have, in their beautiful brochures in the back, they tell you where everything is at. We help them map out and circle out the places that they should be tapping into, guidance, academic counseling, tutorial. If there's free tutoring, you need to tap into that. Key staff members, professors. Other thing is that we've put in so many kids into schools, and specific schools, specifically in New York, that we have a really strong alumni base. So we tap them into our alumni, and we let the alumni know via email or when they come back during the breaks that, hey, Pablo's coming to your school. You need to take care, look after them, watch out for them, help them through the process. We also try to make sure that they start on a good note by picking the right classes. That's really, really key. Not taking on full-time jobs, which many of our kids have to do, and they've done this for years because they're many of the providers of their families. Connecting them with staff mentors, peer mentors, the cultural organizations. I'm a big, proponent of the cultural organizations. It helped me support me through my days at Binghamton as well as at University of Pittsburgh. Time management skills, financial management skills. Those are, I think, the very key in any transition programs that you're going to have. We're actually this year raising dollars to hopefully hire someone full-time for the College Career Discovery Center who are going to follow the kids while they're in school. We really don't have the capacity to do that now, but I feel like if we really want to see these kids through, we've got them in, but now we got to make sure they stay in, because there's a huge, retention issue now, a huge, especially with males, but across the board, we have to find a way to keep them there.
Instead of doing this in a patchwork quilt, I understand that that's the model, but wouldn't it be great if they gave us the money at UVA and we take our recent graduates and have them do this work? Who better to get people excited about college than people that just did it themselves? And really came from the experience of watching all these great kids come to my office and say, Dean Hurd, I want to go to medical school or I want to go to law school, but I can't go right away. I need a gap year. I need to go do some service. You look at the numbers of kids applying for Teach for America or Peace Corps, or some of the other great service opportunities out there. And basically that was the aha moment. I thought, why instead of sending our young people to Los Angeles or Houston from Virginia, or instead of sending them to a third world country, why don't we keep them here? Look at these numbers, and really get the college going right up in Virginia. And my argument was really, as a flagship institution, we have to do this. We really need to think about public education and think about ways to make sure that they know, every citizen in Virginia knows that they can go to college. And so I went back to my office and wrote a little piece up. I sent it off to my dean at the time, Ed Ayers, who is a huge champion of this, and he's now become the president of the University of Richmond. But Ed said, let's go for it. Why don't you call the foundation? I called the foundation and said, I know this isn't what you're looking for, but would you be willing to talk to us about placing recent graduates in low-income, low-college-going high schools to be college access advisors? About 3 or 4 months later, we got a check for $623,000, and we were off. We had a good year. We recruited 22 advisors for our second year, again, trying to expand across the state of Virginia. I was just telling my friends here up on the panel, Virginia is a big state. When you are down by UVA-wise, you're actually west of Detroit and closer to 5 other capitals than you are to Richmond. So we're talking about a big state. So we were trying to get as many advisors out there and raise the funds to get this to really be a statewide program. As that happened, I got a phone call from the Jack Kent Cooke Foundation, and they said, we're so pleased with what's happening at UVA that we want to make this a national program. So they gave us a $10 million expansion grant. I almost fell off my chair at that moment. They invited 169 schools to apply. An exciting number, 56 of them actually did apply. And last March, they named 10 recipients of what we now call the National College Advising Corps, and so that's what I direct. National College Advising Corps is now University of California at Berkeley, Utah, University of Utah, University of Alabama, University of Missouri, Tufts, Brown, Franklin and Marshall, Penn State, Loyola College, and UNC Chapel Hill, in addition to the University of Virginia. But we have 62 advisors this year doing this work, and we'll be up to 130 next year with the hopes to expand to other universities and other states in the future. So that's kind of where we're at. I think this program's exciting on a lot of levels. I think there's nobody better to kind of get kids excited than this near-peer advising. They have a credibility that the rest of us just don't have because they're so close in age. I think the diversity that this has shown, I know when we first sent a student down to Southwest Virginia, there was a real image problem, to be honest with you, that why would UVA be sending this kid down here? And these kids in the schools were like, UVA, why aren't you working at Wall Street? You know, we didn't know anybody normal went to UVA. But it turns out that, you know, he never wore his blue blazer. He drove a pickup truck. He went hunting with the principal. And all of a sudden he had this credibility like, wow, wait, normal people do go to UVA. They don't all go to Wall Street. Not that there's anything wrong with going to Wall Street, but the idea really was in Southside and Southwest Virginia that UVA was not their school. To a lot of young people, they really believe that. I think one of the great things about this program is that they're really demystifying higher education, that they can say, hey, I was a low-income student and I had to work part-time and my parents were stressed out about it, but if I can do this, you can do this too. Or, you know what, I was a first-generation student and I know it's scary, I know you can't talk to some people at home about this, but if I can do it, you can do it too. That first year they saw in one-on-one sessions, they had over 7,883 student appointments. They had 494 classroom visits. They had 110 workshops. They had 1,017 parent meetings. So again, we totally broke this. I had a lot of cynical people that said, oh, you're going to put these kids in there and they're not going to be able to talk to parents. They can talk to parents. Parents who are worried about their students or want their students to succeed, if they see a competent, passionate young person, they will listen to them. And all of a sudden, getting that PIN number for a FAFSA form, or all of a sudden getting that person to take a campus visit, or even getting the parent on the bus to take the campus visit. Those things all of a sudden become possibilities. They did 43 field trips, again, to schools beyond the host institution, 154 SAT prep workshops, and they helped file 668 FAFSA forms. And that was just the first 14. So when you think about the scalability of having our young graduates across this country do this kind of outreach, it's just very exciting.
One of the things that guides our work is that we believe in the students. We believe that in all of these areas there are children who are capable of going on to compete at some of the most rigorous educational institutions in the country. We believe that fervently. And if we cannot find these students, then we look inside and we say something is wrong with the tools we're using to find these kids. It's not the fault of the children, it's the fault of those who are trying to help the children, that we cannot identify which kids these are. So we work very, very hard at trying to develop a technology of assessment that is going to enable us to find students who may not look gifted, who may not act gifted, who may not speak as though they're gifted, who certainly are not going to a school where gifted kids just jump out. But they are there, and we have to find them, and we have to get them educated. The process that we use does not include standardized testing. The reason it does not is because we don't believe that standardized testing serves our population well. And so therefore we have learned to use other measures to help figure out who these kids are. We have an application process. The child has to fill out the application. They have to get a recommendation from an academics area teacher. They have to rate themselves on a list of criteria, including how well they study, how well they read, how well they write, whether they have leadership capability and all of that, because we have determined that students know themselves well. And if they say that they can do these things, we have to assume that they can. We have to give them the benefit of the doubt. Each of the applications is read by 3 people, and then we meet in an admissions committee just like in college, and this is fine because they need to get used to this starting in the 9th grade so that they're not in shock when these things occur later on in their lifetimes. And then we select a group of students and we work with those students throughout the course of the year. We fill spaces in the higher grades as kids move because, of course, our schools are very transient. So unfortunately, we do lose some who move away. We don't lose many who stay, but we lose some who move away. We have several curriculum emphases that we work on. Of course, critical thinking is one of them, and service and mentoring is another. The one that I like the best is becoming a citizen of the world, because we really want them to understand that they live on a planet and not in a city or in a neighborhood. And so we work very hard to try and give them the tools and the habits of mind that they need, what we call habits of mind, so that they can go out into the world and be successful. We also advertise ourselves to the children as being a safe place to be smart, so that they can show up after school and they don't have to worry that people will laugh if they want to read their poetry, which oftentimes is not very good, but still it's poetry and they are encouraged to write it. We talk to them about the ways that they can show how smart they are without depending upon a standardized test, which does not measure some of the things that they are very proficient in. For example, being street smart and understanding how to negotiate and navigate your way through difficult situations. A lot of them have athletic ability. They can do things that they've learned to do to survive that those of us who haven't learned those things have to go to get MBAs to learn how to do. So these are the kinds of things that we work with them on. We have wonderful results. I've told you the colleges that some of our kids have gone to. We do have students who come back and speak to our kids on a variety of levels. When we have this College Expo this coming Monday in Newark, we will have a student from Holy Cross, a student from Hampshire College who went there as a James Baldwin Scholar, and a student from Smith to come back and speak with our students and tell them why this is really important for them to do. We also have a group of associate scholars who are connected to us through newsletters and through distance learning, which is sort of a rudimentary program, but we have already signed up a bunch of kids in 16 different states who are very interested in connecting themselves to pathways to college, and they get, little things that help them to go on, and they have a number they can call if they need to get specific information. So I guess the way that I would leave you is to say that what we have determined is that a small number of students and a small number of dedicated teachers can change the quality and climate of a school. And so we are about institution building. Although we started out trying to figure out how to get these 100 kids through school, we now have determined that we can do things like invite some of those students who are not part of our program to participate in this College Expo. that will in fact have an impact on the school in ways that we have not determined. We are in Newark in 3 different places. We are in Detroit. We are in Arkansas. And we are looking forward to getting additional schools in the next year. We have several places that we are looking at in terms of spreading the program there. So that's the story of Pathways to College.